Hi, everybody. This is Bryan Smith here with 321 Gang, and this is our weekly podcast, Change the Conversation. Thanks for joining us. Today, we are extremely excited to have joining us Dean Leffingwell, the director, I'm making sure I get this right, the director and chief methodologist at Scaled Agile Incorporated. Welcome, Dean.
Hey, thanks, Bryan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Last time I think we saw each other was in San Antonio at the SAFe Summit. I think we were wearing aviator goggles and helmets and capes, right?
Did you go to the rodeo, though?
Absolutely. It was
the
awesome.
rodeo was the best. So I don't know what we're going to do at this year's DC Summit. It's going to be hard to compete with the rodeo, but, you know, the heat is on the team.
I don't know. Maybe some excitement in the Senate, Congress, something like that.
Maybe walk by some government buildings that are already shut down, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Hopefully they're not still shut down by then. Anyway, really appreciate you being here. I wanted to start out on a serious note here. Mm-hmm. The community is asking about this. I'm sure most people know this, but I've been wondering this for a while. What is the E for in SAFe?
Well, widely renowned to stand for enterprise, but truth be known, it was a Scaled Agile Framework, SAF, and we tried that for a while. And Drew and I were sitting around. And he goes, "That sounds like that infection you get when you're in the hospital." You know, I went to the hospital for appendicitis, but I got a SAF infection. He said it needs to be safe. Okay, and I said, well, guess what? You know, my second youngest daughter's name is Emily. So it's Scaled Agile Framework for Emily, but very few people know that. That's a top secret. Yep.
Wow.
Just personalized a little bit.
That's really interesting to know. I'm really glad I asked that question then, because I didn't know the Emily story. So that's really interesting.
That's a fact.
Agile Framework for Emily. Well,
that's right.
Emily, that one's for you. And of course, you were talking about Drew Jamillo. You're co-founder of the Scaled Agile Framework. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Drew and I go back probably 8 or 10 years now. Started working in a couple different contexts, including Nokia Navtex division. And I had published, I think it was my second book, I'm not sure. He was using that as a guideline. They brought me in, and he and I basically, methodologically, we haven't been apart since. So we worked together to build the company and founded it together, and have had, the good fortune of building a successful small business in this weird method education IP courseware space.
Well, and so actually in Scandinavia with Nokia?
Actually, this was, Drew and I met in Chicago. There's a division called Navteq, which was part of Nokia at the time. They actually sold that to what became HERE, which is the company that was bought by a consortium of German automobile manufacturers. So they're in the mapping division, and they didn't want to necessarily have Google show up in their car every day. Find me a gas station, please Google, and here's an extra $1 for the ad. So the German automotive manufacturers bought HERE Corporation, and that's their competitive product offering there. Interesting.
Okay, full of lots of fun facts here today. So on a lighter note, well, that was a pretty light note, but I wanted to tell you that I've made up a joke about the Scaled Agile Framework. You want to hear it?
Is it funny?
I don't know.
Okay, well,
so we're going to try it out on you, and if it's funny, then maybe we'll actually include it in the podcast. We'll see.
It'll be copyrighted you then.
Okay. All right, here, I'm going to make sure I don't mess it up, because I did make it up. What do SAFe consultants and urologists have in common?
What do SAFe consultants and urologists have in common?
They're both concerned about flow.
Okay.
Right?
That's kind of funny. Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of funny.
I'll give you that one. That's kind of funny. Yeah, that's kind of funny.
Well, anyway, I was looking back at some podcasts and some other writings, and I came across flow, and I was like, I've heard that word before.
Not every tech podcast has below the belt humor.
Only here.
Only at 321 Gang.
That's right. That's right. We have capes, goggles, and below the belt humor.
Yep.
I might get the horse's ass award for that one, but we'll see.
You might. It's been in my office lately, so just
it has. Yeah. All right. Very good. Very good. Hopefully people know what we're referring to. So, all right, well, let's get into it. As you know, 321 Gang has for many years focused on the systems engineering community. and best practices, some tools, and we participated in helping bring some of the systems engineering content to the framework. But I wanted to ask sort of before that, I mean, when did you start thinking about including systems engineering content into the framework, and why did you decide to do it when you did?
Okay, well, a deep, dark secret is that I actually am or was a systems engineer. Like you, I grew up in that space. I have a degree in aerospace engineering, and went on into biomedical engineering, and then went into software because nobody could figure out how to program those cranky little mini computers that didn't have any software associated with them. So I've always been a systems thinker. I'm systems engineering. I just approach things. I've always taken a systems view. That's one of the principles of the framework. But I get into software really heavily, and I spent the next, basically 30 years as a startup CEO, building interesting things, things that go bump in the night, robotics, adventure ride vehicles and all kinds of things that had software in them. But I became more fascinated by the software side because it was in mechanical and systems engineering, there's laws of physics involved.
There's limitations.
There's mechanics, there's mechanics, there's dynamics, there's all kinds of forces that you can figure out. In software, it's all intellectual.
And you can do it right there and then, right? This didn't work.
Hanging out,
I'll change
exactly.
it. I'll
refactor it. So I moved into software for my career, and I spent my career with 4 or 5 different startups, including this one. Scaled Agile is kind of the most recent in that category. And I focused throughout on essentially very safe software for systems. And so we worked on the software part and adopted Scrum and Agile and XP practices, things like pairing and collective ownership and test-driven development, all of these, I think, high degree or highly technical skills that you can associate with well-done software craft. So I went that way for about 20 or 25 years and developed the framework in support of that. Mostly that was at places that were independent software vendors. Some were in the IT shops, et cetera, and some, a few less probably, were doing embedded systems for large-scale systems. Well, as we got into the marketplace, and over the next, 5, 8 years, 10 years, software started eating those systems alive. There isn't a system that moves now that doesn't have software in it. Well, that's an overstatement. But any system of complexity has, millions of lines of code. So the question started to become, as people started attending class and saying, well, we'd like to build our systems in a lean and agile manner too. You've got this laid out for software, and you've got some things like continuous integration that don't really apply here, and test-driven development that, I don't see how that makes any sense. I can't test the power supply chassis before I built it, that kind of thing. But everything else, cadence and synchronization, very fast feedback, quicker system integration, validation, the role of the product owner, the role of the Scrum Master, all these methods and practices seem to apply equally well, but there was no runway for that. There were no books that were written on, basically using lean and agile practices to develop systems engineering. So
now,
go ahead.
Real quick, would it be fair to say that that software? So let me back up a little bit. So 321 Gang got into the Lean Agile game because our clients pulled us in. We had software clients who were working in large systems engineering organizations who were seeing the value of Lean and Agile. And then their compatriots who were doing hardware or electrical engineering or mechanical said, wow, you're getting a lot of benefit out of this. How do we apply that? And so we were called in to sort of help them through that process, and we realized very quickly that it's a pretty tough nut to crack, and especially at scale. So that's when we sort of came your way as well.
Well, I remember distinctly you guys showing up in class and having other systems builders in the class, and kind of at every break and lunchtime saying, well, we need to apply this in other domains. Can we extend this? So that launched a significant branch. And folks that we know, like Harry Kahneman, was directly involved in developing the systems engineering content. We called that SAFe for Lean Systems Engineering, and that was really convenient because it was a sandbox, right? We didn't present it as anything proven or solid. We presented it as ideas and process. And we did 2 or 3 different sessions, some back on the Beltway, some in Boulder, and systems builders started showing up. And we just asked them things like, okay, is it the chief engineer here? We kind of call that the product manager. What do you think? And we say, well, we know what a chief engineer does, and we want them to focus somewhat differently. So let's use this other term. And things like capabilities, which is a very natural discussion for somebody building a large system, but not quite as an obvious a discussion for somebody building a small software product. That type of language started to come to bear. The what was the systems of systems layer, which is now the solution layer, started to grow. And we had basically this 3-tier system, which was team, program, and system of systems. Well, then we were involved in teaching probably the 3rd variant of that class, and because we were talking about building really big systems, people that were building really big software systems showed up. And they said, well, what about the portfolio layer? And the systems people said, well, we have portfolio issues too. If I'm building a radio for a vehicle, that OEM is not the only buyer. So I've got both a local view of how that system fits in their system and a portfolio view. So I need the portfolio level. So now we're really struck. It's like, okay, do we really have to add another level to SAFe? And long story short, we did. We mislabeled it for a while, the value stream layer. That was a mistake. We were trying to communicate that when lots of arts work together in large value streams, they need these practices. But it was really always the large solution layer. It was originally the system of systems layer, but that didn't roll off the tongue. So we integrated that content into version 4, such that whether you're building a large distributed, application for, banking transactions, or I know a company that was working on bond trading, and a single bond trade touched on the order of 400 applications. That is a system of systems.
That's a system of systems, right? So.
And then the hardware builders started showing up. You know the names. We won't mention them here. People that build warfighters and big others.
Airplanes, missiles. And
absolutely. Elevators, robots, et cetera, and said, well,
helicopters.
We want to be leaner. So we like this. So that was the version 4. We merged the Lean Systems Engineering branch back in to version 4, labeled it wrong, my mistake. And then we moved forward to version 4 or 5 and fixed that and continue to add content like, as you noted earlier, in the regulatory and compliance area. Because when you build big systems, they have to operate with safety and efficacy. So how do you know that robot does only that? How do you know that my car doesn't only turn right safely? So those types of things start to have more and more criticality with respect to fitness for use. So that content grew into 4.5 and kind of off we went. So now in a particular, in an SBC class or even a leading SAFe class, we might have a whole team of people building avionics for the 787. We might have people building bond trading applications or people trying to ship packages from point A to point B, but the problems are all the same. And the good news is the principles of SAFe are universally applicable.
Mm-hmm. It's all about flow.
It is. It is.
Well, so you touched upon a few different industries there. Aerospace and defense, big systems industry, automotive. We didn't explicitly mention that one earlier, but that's a big one. We certainly want to make sure these automated cars know how to turn left and right and see things on the road, and those are very complex systems. Medical devices, I would put in that category as well.
Absolutely.
Of the systems organizations, those and others that you've worked with, is one industry sort of outpacing the other in its adoption of SAFe?
I wouldn't say so. I would say that, the more tangible things you have to integrate in your system, the less easy it is to think about the basic principles of lean and agile development. I mean, if you're going to build 10 power supplies that fit in a chassis, you've got to know a lot about those power supplies in the chassis. You can't just go, refactor at the last minute and say, hey, I've got changing specifications here, and it turns out they don't fit in the chassis that I purchased 1,000 of. So the rules are very different. And I think that because those rules are different, and perhaps some in the Agile community, maybe myself at a point, had kind of a naive notion about that, well, they're exactly the same. Well, it's not exactly the same in terms of the practices, but the principles are. fast feedback, fast integration, test first, those things all still apply. So I think those industries came along later because, our stuff wasn't written for them. The roots of Agile or an XP and Scrum, those are software guys. They were working at Chrysler Corporation and Sutherland at actually a medical company building medical software. They designed these systems for software, and I designed the original version of SAFe for software. So you can't walk across the hall to a medical guy and say, hey, see this Scrum book here? It's pretty cool. This software guy, Ken Schwaber, wrote it, and there's a daily stand-up, and blah, 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 and we just use a common backlog, and they go, what planet are you from? That is not our world. So I think we've had some resistance there. But when you look at the needs, which is, time to market, higher degrees of innovation, higher quality, those needs are the same as in the software industry. So the people building systems aren't immune to that. And as they now face an increasingly global world, and as 70, 80, 90% of the value proposition moves through software, you can't have a method for, software engineering and a different method for building ASICs and a different method for building the mechanical stuff. It's all got to fit together in the satellite at some point. So I think there's a strong demand and a real need for a harmonizing view. And SAFe as a framework provides that. It has a common taxonomy. We know what a thing is. Why is it a thing? Why is that what it is? Because we define it that way. So we use some common language like user stories and some from the systems engineering world like capabilities and wrap that together into a system. And that's an ontology, if you will, a relationship amongst those elements. So that system and the relationship amongst those elements and that taxonomy means that we can talk about things like a system demo and have it have meaning versus a solution demo, an epic versus a story. You have to know what those things mean. You can't advance science if you can't tell a dog from a cat, right? You don't know what kind of vet you need at that point. So we had to create a sufficient semantic language to be able to say, okay, test first means this. And it could mean this in hardware, mean this in software, but this is what we mean by test first. A user story has this definition. A feature has this definition.
Mm-hmm. Well, and those communities had a lot of pushback and still do in some respects. And until or unless the framework includes them and includes a language, a taxonomy, as you put it, that makes sense to them, we'll continue to get that resistance, right?
I think so, and that's why we worked so hard with the big systems builders to talk about our language. And simple things we take for granted, like program increment. Is that the right word? Right? It's kind of a super sprint. Is it a quantum leap in functionality? What the heck is that? Well, look, it's a program increment. You're building a big thing. Every so often, we're going to stop and take a hard look at where we are. Does that mean that we only integrate, in PIs? No. It means that we're going to plan in PIs. We're going to review in PIs. I know when to invite my general in to see my stuff. I can't invite him in every 2 weeks for a system demo, but maybe every 8 weeks I can get them there. And when we're struggling to meet the requirements and understand that the requirements don't really solve the problem, and my customers in the room, we have an entirely different discussion about, they'll say, well, let's change that then. But if we're swapping emails and sending documents back and forth and we're hanging behind a contract that says the system has to do boo and it doesn't do boo well, you're going to suffer from really terrible economic outcomes. So bringing those people together in, for example, PI planning, doesn't matter what they're building. We do PI planning in our company for the whole company, when our whole company using SAFe. Is that a traditional system demo looking at a system? Sometimes it is. Sometimes we look at the platform. Sometimes we look at the framework. Sometimes we look at our corporate website. Sometimes we look at just things we're doing internally to facilitate the velocity of future development. But the principle is the same.
So you said the word quantum a couple of times. You ever going to get that in there and strip out PI?
No, I'm not.
You lost that battle?
Yeah, in a way, I'm sorry I got talked out of it, but that's water under the bridge.
Yeah, that's all.
It's a tough thing. People have meaning around words, and if you go too far from the meaning, they're distressed that they don't get it. But if you only use words that already have pre-associated meaning, and you don't change the meaning, you can't advance the science. So we're involved in picking words like, controversial words like feature. Okay, there's no feature in some forms of agile development, right? They're user stories, and we do that. Well, it's not a complex thing, but you got to, pick a word put a definition to it, and then use it reliably and repeatedly. And now I know that a feature is bigger than a bunch of stories. And I know that a lot of stories are parented by features. I know that a lot of stories do other things that don't necessarily have to have a mom and dad feature. And the same way, epics in the hierarchy, and that the one we added when we added that level with capabilities. So I think it's important not to underestimate the power of language and taxonomy. And indeed, as we've approached things like internationalization and localization, we've been pushed by our people in the marketplace, partners and end users, believe it, to not translate the big picture. Because things like lean portfolio management don't have translations into simplified Chinese. So when they make something up, they create a different connotation. So our stakeholders say, when somebody says, this is a new epic and I want to put a lean business case with it, I don't want two different interpretations of what that means. So we might translate books about SAFe, we might translate articles and glossaries, but lean portfolio management is exactly that. It's not translated to another term.
Interesting. So I wanted to get back to the conversation. Well, I wanted to get back to something you said earlier about quality. The latest release of the big picture of the framework added a lot of content around quality. And I've got some cheat notes over here, so I'm gonna cheat a little bit here. I think, let's see, compliance and lean quality management systems, aka QMS, and a few of the things, build the solution and compliance incrementally, organize for value and compliance, build quality and compliance in, continuously verify and validate, release validated solutions on demand. So I read them all. And what I take away from that is there's a lot of systems content in there around validation, around compliance, around regulations. And so I wanted to ask you to comment a little bit about that, and maybe you have an example in the medical device area that might make sense. I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't have one, but if you had one in medical device, that would be great.
Well, so the answer is we absolutely do medical device development. People build MRI systems, medical infusion pumps, chemotherapy distribution software, almost DNA synthesizers, X-ray machines, ultrasound. They're all built with software now. And I have a kind of unique perspective on that, which is the first company I started back when I was a young whippersnapper. Ended up building embedded systems for the medical industry. So we built, for example, the first microprocessor-based ventilator that was ever approved by the FDA for use outside of the hospital. So we built the first one that could go home reliably and had a feature called intermittent mandatory ventilation. And that sounds complex, but if you think about a ventilator-dependent patient, when they try to breathe, you better not breathe for them. Because if they're starting to get those muscles going again and you breathe for them, those muscles will basically decay and they will be ventilator-dependent for life. So that's a feature that if you think about, the computer sits there and watches and says, I think they tried to breathe. Okay. Then you watch again.
Turn off.
Has it been too long? Okay, now we need to give a breath. So that type of wits can really only come through software algorithms. So in building those systems, I became very concerned about not just the loosey-goosey, we wrote a bunch of code, but does that do exactly what we said it was going to do? And then, of course, we were operating under good manufacturing practices, under the good manufacturing practices, and I forget the design practices associated with that. And in that place, there are some interesting rules. There's rules like there shall be a software requirement specification. It's not optional. It's in the FDA Part 830. You're going to do it, or you don't get your device approved, or if you get your device approved somehow and you don't do it and you screw it up, you could go to jail because you violated federal code. Well, what happens when we say the word SRS? Everybody goes, I know what that is. Figure out all the requirements in advance, get them signed off and proven, make sure the clinical team signs off on them, go through a full tech review spec, make sure that everybody knows anything about it, it's signed off on this, and then we're going to build exactly that thing. Well, we know it doesn't work that way at all. So when you go into that world and start thinking about those aspects and you read the documents, literally the specific document inside, for example, FDA Part 830, Federal Code of Regulations, it doesn't say you should use waterfall development. It
No,
says
absolutely not.
we prefer concurrent engineering, but it says there's an SRS. So what does that mean? It means that people that are smart about this goes, well, before I'm going to hit these certain milestones, trials on a patient, a shipment to an end user, whatever, I'm going to have a fully verified and validated SRS. Does that mean I write it first? No.
No.
It means that we could be very fluid during our product development and have stories come in and out, and they're not locked and loaded and subject to authority, governance and sign off.
Right.
The developer says that didn't work, I changed the story. But when that settles out and you say the system now does this, you put a wrapper on it. And you can do that by writing traditional specifications using traditional tools, the type of tools that you guys support so well, the things that have the security and compliance you need so that somebody just can't willy-nilly delete a test case, right, in the middle of your world. But you don't have to do that during the development cycle. So the way of working can be different from the way of validating. So what we've been doing, and with your help, frankly, is communicating the industry is that, yes, these things must happen. A software requirement specification, a system specification can exist. But that does not make you capitulate to doing it all up front and then building the wrong thing because you wrote it down that way. And that's a pretty big misconception in the industry, and one that I think we've got years ahead of us before people wake up and say, oh, I get it. When we like it, and it's
what's interesting to me,
we'll wrap it up.
So the big joke early on, and it continues today, is that there's no documentation with Agile.
Right.
But what kills me is that, in fact, because you know exactly what's being built in, what you're putting in, because you're changing it maybe, but then you build it and you know exactly what you built.
And you test it.
Take that and you test it, and then you write the documentation for that piece, and because you know it's in there.
Right.
So you end up spending so much less time, there's so much less waste on the front end, and what documentation output there is exactly what's in the system. So
there's a much deeper story that we can't get into on verification and validation. But if you think about the way good solid code is written, and let's take the edge case, we're going to write the test first. That means that A, there is one. B, I'm forced to really understand the behavior of the system. C, when I integrate the code, the test is already there. And basically what I've done, I've verified that the test expresses requirements or validates the requirements that I'm trying to meet. And then validation, well, what's that look like? Well, does it really meet the needs? Was there a product owner involved that could say that's good? Does the product owner have access to clinical expertise? So verification and validation, it has to be built in situ. So when we said do it incrementally, we talk about basically automating all the V&V stuff that can be automated, building it into the process to the extent practical. And where there remain some things that you can't do every day, like maybe a complete documentation sign-off submittal or exploratory testing, you do those on cadence. So you automate and build in everything you can, and you do cadence-based application of the other practices you need to assure full V&V. So if I was ever going to be hooked up to an infusion pump again, and I have been, I want to make sure that that V&V was done not by somebody sitting with a trace matrix and a big fat document pretending like that code actually did that, but by a team that said, I know that code does exactly that because I wrote the test, and it passed the test.
Exactly. Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. So let's move on to a slightly different topic. In reading through some of the case studies for Scaled Agile, the benefits are quite dramatic.
Right.
I've got some numbers here. I'm going to cheat again. 25 to 75% increase in productivity, 25 to 75% defect reduction, 20 to 50% improvement in quality. My notes now move over here. More engaged employees, faster time to market. So really dramatic. In the
surprising
systems,
and unbelievable. If it weren't for the fact that it would be unbelievable if it weren't for the fact that that's what the end users are reporting.
Exactly.
Not we're reporting. That's what they're saying about their process.
Yep, absolutely. And sometimes, to be honest with you, I tell my clients, even if it was half of the lowest number on that scale, it could be millions and millions of dollars or some benefit in expressed in dollars for you. So is it worth the time? Was it worth exploring? And most often the answer is yes. So my question about that though is, as we talked about earlier, lean agile practices, or at least agile practices, really written 20, 25, 30 years ago for software. Scaled Agile, sort of on the coattails of that, scaling primarily in software organizations. Can systems organizations really expect the same level of benefit here as we're seeing in these case studies that are mostly software driven?
Yes, they can, and we tend to see it again and again and again. Now, you might not reduce time to market for a new infusion prompt from 18 months to 4 months, the way that some of the large-scale IT shops have dramatically reduced the time to market for their applications. But you might reduce it from 3 years to 2 years because the extensive protocols you have to go through. But you eliminate so many of the delays in the process. You get fast feedback. You build quality in from the start. You avoid the big rework cycles. Fitness for use is established much, much earlier. You build mocks and stubs. You do whatever it takes to actually be able to demonstrate that this thing is evolving right. So we don't see any difference. We don't see people building, ASICs or satellite systems coming back and saying, well, we reduced time to market by 10%. We see the same type of thing. Agile, iterative, and incremental development simply is faster in every way. And because it's based, well, I won't say it's based upon Lean, but I would say Lean would espouse the same basic practices. And that means that the quality is built in for a significant reason. And it's not just to feel good about quality. It's built in because otherwise you can't go fast. So if you want to build manufacturing, if you want to manufacture products highly efficiently, they have to have endemic quality because the rework cycle is the killer. Well, our rework cycle here can sometimes go back 18 months. So building quality in is really, yes, everybody always says quality, build quality in, yeah. But there's ways to do it. There are specific practices built into the framework and built into other Lean Agile models that help assure that quality is endemic.
I think it's waste reduction. In my experience anyway, in the large systems organizations that we work in, waste reduction is probably the greatest single benefit we've seen. And it expresses itself across the entire engineering life cycle.
It does. And we like to think of waste in terms of, tangible stuff that you throw away and less scrapped ASICs and less scrapped power supplies. But waste is also just delay time. Time spent wasting, right? The waste of false assumptions,
the waste of writing an SRS for a medical device that you're going to throw away most of it because at the end of the day it doesn't meet your needs.
Or worse, you're going to defend it because it's the SRS that you submitted.
Right, that's true. Right. Well, so we're going to wrap up here soon, but I wanted to ask you, in the systems engineering space, is getting started with SAFe any different than in a more traditional IT software kind of shop?
So, I think everybody believes their problems are different. I'm in an enterprise here. I think our problems are different, but the answer is really not. You've been through your training. You know that the first half a day or even more are basic principles. And the principles, the principles trump the practices. So you spend time understanding what it means to take a systems view, understand what it means to build incrementally with fast integrated learning cycles, understand why decentralized decision-making is so critical to flow and throughput and speed to market, understanding why there's no substitute for getting the 80 or 200 people that are actually building this thing together every 10 weeks to talk about it. There's no replacement for that. So we don't start different or see it different. I think that I'd say the major problems evolve around integration, because software has this promise of continuous integration even across disparate platforms. That's just not the case. If I've got four switching power supplies that I built for a satellite, and they've all been breadboarded and modified, I can't just put them in a stack and smash them together with my foot and say, okay, now be one. There are real physical and labor aspects involved in integration. So sometimes the frequency of feedback changes. Sometimes the way you think. If you're building a mold, are you going to want some pretty decent specs? Yeah, you are. So you might invest more up front. You might say, look, this is the case where this documentation is really going to save our bacon. Oh, this is a case where it doesn't really matter. We can we can build that part out of a vat of glue up until we get ready to go to production mode. So the practices vary, but the principles are the same.
Well, now it gets back really, in my opinion anyway, and tell me if you agree, with leadership. because leadership has to make the call whether to write the documentation or to, for this particular product or for this particular part of the system, we're going to do something different because there's no value in the documentation up front. We want to push decisions until later, that kind of thing. And so I know that train leadership, get leadership on board is a pretty big nut to crack. How do you recommend that leadership learn about the Scaled Agile Framework?
Right. So we always start with leading SAFe. That's a class for managers and leaders. It starts with principles. Practices are fairly late. Half of that course is basically principles and experiencing things like PI planning. Another third or so of the course is thinking about leadership. And then the part that's left, whatever percent is remaining, is really the practices of SAFe. So we spend a lot of time kind of getting people's mindsets oriented towards a new way of working, thinking about, like you do. You think about flow all the time. Now you make jokes about it. You think about Q links. You see Q. You see little.
Whenever you say flow, you're going to think about that.
Exactly
now, right.
You think about, you see Qs. You see work in process. You start to realize that, wow, that doesn't have to be that big a batch. If I could lower the transaction cost of testing, I could have a smaller batch. So you think differently. And I think my favorite quote from Deming is, it's not enough that management commit themselves to quality and productivity. They must know what it is they must do. So this is not a sign. So we don't give our leaders a sign that says quality is important and lean is cool, go forth and be lean. We give them the training they need to show others. And there's a word for that. I don't use that in training because it's just too hard to say. But the word for that is a lean thinking manager teacher. So our goal with all of our stakeholders is to teach them to be lean thinking and manager teachers. Not to have, the experts come in and save them all the time, but to know what it is they must do. And that requires a new mindset. Understanding of lean principles, understanding the House of Lean. The Agile Manifesto is here. We do exercises in every class about the manifesto and say it's 19 years old. Maybe it's time to put it to bed. And they come back and say, no. It turns out it's even more important when we build big systems. So those are the principles that we need to build our practices around. And then the practices can vary a bit, and I'd say that's what's different between building, maybe an MRI machine. How do I test that? Well, I've got to be in a concrete bunker, right?
Right.
Not a simple thing to do the end user testing on that. So you can laugh and argue all you want about, it should be continuous testing. Well, okay, you figure out how to get in and out of that bunker. Right, to make sure that we're not, so that the radiation is really only the radiation we create. So there's some practical realities associated with the principles, but the principles are the same.
Now, the manager-teacher, would that be synonymous to the servant leader for the folks further down the food chain? Is that not the same kind of principle where you're,
No, I would say they're fundamentally different. So a servant leader is a leader who understands that their best work is when they help others achieve their objectives. And that tends to be very much related towards the individual and the team. The lean thinking manager teacher says, I actually know some stuff here. And it's kind of, more like Scrum Master. My job is to help teach you this. Now, can a lean thinking manager teacher be a servant leader? Absolutely. But it's not a passive role to be a lean thinking manager teacher. It's a role that says, hey, haven't we seen this problem before? Have we thought about root cause analysis? Maybe we should step aside. What was the result of the last retro? You didn't do one? Well, I thought that was part of basic practice. I thought that was built into your model.
Right. Well, this has been great, Dean. Is there anything I haven't asked you or any other pieces of advice you want to leave us with? I don't know if there's anything on your mind, anything about the systems side of the house or medical devices that we haven't touched upon that might be important to talk about?
So I would just say my conclusion with all this white hair, which seems it's being exacerbated by the lighting, is that we don't have better paradigms now than approaching our systems development with a lean agile mindset and lean agile practices. It's immutable. It's not like a company is going to survive in the next 10 years, waterfalling their way through a medical device, a satellite, or anything. So we're on a trend line that will eventually collapse to the point where we all think and do these things down the lean agile path. I look forward to that time. There may be a time when we don't call it agile, we don't call it lean. I don't care what we call it, but we will have eliminated much of the waste in the system. We'll get faster feedback, and we'll just have higher skills in creating innovative products that better fit the market needs far more quickly.
Well, I'm looking forward to that time. Dean Leffingwell, the Director and Chief Methodologist at Scaled Agile Framework. Thanks again so much for joining us in our podcast.
Great. Thanks. See you, Bryan.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.